Today we're going to play for you my first of two interviews that I did at Netroots Nation in New Orleans, Louisiana, where I was last week. This one is with J.D. Scholten, who's running against Steve King, the incumbent Republican. You'll notice that at one point during the interview, a second line band starts playing, and that was not something that we knew was going to happen, but we did the best to power through my interview from Netroots with J.D. Scholten. I'm here with J.D. Scholten, who's running in Iowa's 4th District against Republican incumbent Steve King. Uphill battle for sure.
Uphill battle, but what we're seeing is it's a lot of new things that we haven't seen in years, and this race is going to come down to the wire.
A lot of these races we're seeing in your race, we're seeing with Ted Cruz in Texas and other races where the fundraising numbers are actually pretty solid for the challenger, yeah. But in the end, it's money, it's incumbency, it's a lot of different things. Let's talk about the money part first. Right. I mean, what's your approach when it comes to the fundraising?
Well, it's funny you mention that race because we find ourselves very similar. When you have such an opponent who's well known like that, there's a lot of people who want to get involved. For 3 consecutive quarters, we've raised money in all 39 counties in our district and in all 50 states. We do traditional meet and greets, call time, but we also do a lot of digital, and we get connected with folks all across the nation. And we've been able to outraise him this entire election cycle, and in the last 9 months, by a 2-to-1 margin.
That's stunning. I mean, we know that I think it's something like 85% of races end up being won by the candidate that raises more money. Yeah. Of course, there is the power of incumbency as well, but I think one of the advantages, and tell me if I'm wrong, to being a challenger against a very well-known candidate is that the entire country maybe is more aware of the race and has an incentive to try to help out and get that incumbent out if it's not a popular person.
Absolutely. I mean, nobody should really know who the 4th Congressional District representative is, yet most of America does. And that's the thing, when he makes his off-color comments, which are more and more frequent, I have friends who aren't political, who aren't from Iowa, and they text me or call me and say, hey, is this you? And I like to say that it doesn't represent us, or he doesn't represent us, but representative is his job title, and I'm trying to change that.
What are your sort of big issues in the campaign? And for people who aren't familiar with this particular district, it's very rural, so it's unique. I mean, there's rural parts of Iowa and less rural parts. What are the primary issues that you're focusing on and that voters are telling you are important to them?
Right. Well, it's an interesting thing because right now we're doing a lot of farm forums or in roundtables, and as much as we're talking about tariffs or low commodity prices or trying to break into more markets, we talk about healthcare. And farmers are working that second or third job, or their spouse is working that second to third job in town, or generations that hasn't been the case, just to pay for healthcare. And I mean, I have no problem going into some of the most rural parts of the district, talking about Medicare for all, and people being on board.
What is the positive response? Is it because the farm community in particular has a deficit when it comes to healthcare? Is it because the idea of Medicare for all specifically is becoming more popular, you think, even in rural areas?
I think just the need is so desperate that people are willing to do whatever it takes. Every time I stop for gas, I travel a lot within the district, and every time I stop for gas, most of the gas stations have a donation box. And it's usually someone who just got in an accident or got cancer or some illness. And my goal is to get rid of that. I mean, we live in the wealthiest country in the world. We need to have a system that doesn't rely on donations to pay for healthcare. And people relate to that. And I think wherever you are on the spectrum, people feel that there's a need now. I mean, we have decades that the private industries could have done something, and this is where we're at, and the need is now, and the need it's boiling up amongst most folks.
With a Medicare for all type proposal, would you favor something at the federal level that would be paid for maybe through like an income tax, the way Bernie Sanders has proposed? There's other ideas that would be at the state level. There's differences between universal coverage and an actual government-funded system. What's your approach?
Honestly, I'm open. The need is I feel so desperate that whatever we can do to get there, let's do it. And I'm flexible. I don't believe that one way is the only way. And so what I like to tell folks, because I get asked quite a bit, how are we going to pay for it? Well, America is 4% of the world's population, yet we're 41% of the world's wealth. Somewhere in there is the answer.
And would you, so, I mean, let's talk a little more specifically. If the idea was something at the federal level, it seems more of the ideas are at the federal level than state.
Right.
Would you reallocate money that is already a government revenue, or would you do an additional income tax the way Bernie has proposed?
Yeah, I mean, I would be, honestly, I haven't really weighed exactly how we would go about it, but I'd be open to either one. I mean,
seems like the tax could be a hard sell in some rural places, right? Like,
but also you tell them like, hey, you're paying for it. It's like instead of paying for health insurance, you're paying for it through a tax. And I think they get when you get something in return, it's not as much as a tax as what they view taxes as, that mindset. So I think they'd be open to it. And I mean, we've talked about that in several of these rural meet and greets, and so I think people are open to it.
Tariffs.
Yeah.
Tariffs right now are hitting farmers really hard. They're hitting farmers in the Midwest really, really hard. And yet, for the most part, they're sticking with Trump. And that concerns me a lot, because at this point, we would hope that there would be some repercussions and some consequences.
Right.
If it felt like we were going to see those, I'd be more confident about the midterms.
Yeah.
You're on the ground specifically in the 4th District of Iowa. How are the farmers dealing with the Trump tariffs?
Well, here's the thing is even before the tariffs, farmers have been anxious. And there's, if we just talk about the tariffs, that doesn't really get to the root of the problem. And that the bailout, I like to say that it's like you got punched in the face and then they gave you an ice pack. Like, just don't punch me in the face and it's not as big an issue. Yeah. But I mean, I'm talking to the pork producers and the dairy farmers. They're feeling hit right now, where you see the row crops, the soybean farmers and the corn growers, like they can hold off a little bit till the harvest, but they're still anxious. And so we've had 4 consecutive years of low commodity prices. Soybeans are down. Corn is down near $3 a bushel, and you need about $3.50 to break even. And so farmers are struggling to get the loans that they need, and so it's a lot. It goes a lot deeper than just the tariffs. But all I see is that farmers are anxious, and they're willing to listen where they haven't been able to listen to them.
But do you feel like they're holding Trump accountable?
I think when it comes to Trump, they're a little bit patient. But when it comes to the people, like Representative King, he's not on the Farm Bill committee, the conference committee. And like, if I was in his shoes, I'd be darn sure that I'd be fighting to get on that community tooth and nail and fighting for the people in my district. And he's not doing that, and that's what they see more than they actually probably related to Trump.
Steve King is, I don't know if in cahoots is the right word, but he's associated with Trump in a lot of ways. Is that helping him in that district, or is that at this point a liability?
You know, it's actually 2 completely different things. I do it. I'm not the type of, I don't lump them together. I know a lot of folks do, because you think it go hand in hand, but I could name probably 20 people at the top of my head who are Trump supporters who are on board with us. And so the feeling of fatigue is there with King, where Trump is still new. They're still trying to play it out a little bit. But yeah.
So Steve King and Donald Trump, by many voters seen as sort of affiliated, on the same page when it comes to a lot of different issues. In the district, is that the perception? Is the perception that a vote for King is a vote for Trump, and support of Trump means you support Steve King?
See, I see it differently in the district. I could name 20 people off the top of my head who support us, but also still support Trump. And so the thing with King is there's a fatigue that's part of this, because for 16 years he's been saying controversial things. He's been saying things that have put a blemish on the 4th District, and it's just one of those things where as an outsider, you think it would go hand in hand, but what we're seeing on the ground level is they're two completely different things.
The rural districts often are sort of misunderstood by people on the coasts and big cities, and there's this sort of talking point that because the coastal elites, so-called, just didn't get sort of what's happening in middle America, that helped Donald Trump win. I don't know that I even agree with that narrative, but let's sort of like think about it a little bit. Is there something about rural America that people who have not visited those parts of the country just don't get about the day-to-day lives of people that impacts their politics?
Yeah, I have a tough time answering that question because, I mean, I was born and raised there. Like, I get it. I get why Trump was successful there. I understand, like, my district and the reason why they continue to vote. I don't necessarily agree with it, but it's one of those things where in a district like ours, retail politics and old school style of politics, that's what works. Like as much as like the wave of digital and all this stuff, it's door knocking, it's getting out there. And in Iowa, we're spoiled. When you want, let's say you want Joe Biden to your birthday party barbecue, you can get him on a presidential year. And so you really got to get out there. You can't just sit at home, fundraise and make commercials. That's not going to win you a darn thing. It's getting out there and showing prove how hard you're going to work, prove that you're trustworthy, and prove that you're going to fight for the people of the district, and you're going to earn votes regardless of their voter history.
So in Boston, where we're in a very different political situation than in any part of Iowa, a big conversation right now is how split is the left, democratic socialism versus social democracy, fighting centrist Democrats versus trying to knock out Republicans, and how do you spread resources? Are those even conversations in a place like the 4th District?
You know, when we launched our campaign a year ago, there was that split, that Bernie-Hillary split. But I think one of the best things that our campaign and the most success that our campaign has is that we're an open tent, and that we've been able to bring both sides together. And I mean, part of it is when you go up against King, people just want to beat him, and they're willing to accept things. But I won a primary, and I was further left than the other two, and so I don't think that necessarily won me the primary, but being younger and just having those kind of views, kind of people associate me with the left a little bit more. So I'm fighting to be a Democrat in Iowa, and you just look across the Midwest, and it's hard to come by. And so when you go to these national events, it's that split, and I don't see it just because I'm fighting to be a Democrat.
Are there issues you have to be more careful of as a Democrat in a red state running against somebody who's been there for a while, whether it's because on average the population is more religious than in some other parts of the country, the issue of abortion? Does gay rights even come up at this point, or is it seen sort of like as a settled issue because of the Supreme Court decision?
Right. I feel it's settled. In Iowa, we were the third state to accept it, which was ahead of its time, and the first in the Midwest. I'm not running to lose. I'm not running to hide. I'm running on who I am and what I believe in, and I think that resonates more than kind of being wishy-washy about an issue. It's a very religious district. I'm Catholic myself, but you get caught in these debates, and it's not as black-white as what people think. When you talk about abortions, and my goal is to reduce the number of abortions, and that's something both sides can agree upon. And so I really don't view it as I got to watch what I'm saying or anything like that. I just run on who I am.
When it comes to legislation, what would be the first 3 things you work on if you win?
Healthcare, absolutely. I would campaign finance reform. That's the one thing I can agree with anybody. My neighbor has a truck the size of Texas, he caucused for Trump, and has probably 5 AR-15s. We don't agree on too many things, but the one thing we can always agree upon is getting money out of politics. And so So those are the two. The third thing, something to help our farmers, years and years of consolidation, the pressure, the stress that these farmers have to go year in, year out. I mean, the tariffs couldn't have come at a worse time, an absolute worst time, and we're feeling it in our district.
Well, I think the band is playing us off. I've been speaking with J.D. Scholten, who's running against incumbent Republican Steve King in Iowa's 4th District. Great to meet you. Thank you so much.
Pleasure all mine.